We were talking about Esau and Jacob and the history of their family history. Pastor and I were talking earlier of the deception going all the way back even to Father Abraham. And but then Jacob, he had deceived. He was called the deceiver. He goes to his uncle, and his uncle deceives him, and he ends up being there for 14 years in labor to him for the two daughters, that for his two wives. And from that, even then, he had his favorite. He had his favorite with Rachel's firstborn, which was Joseph, and he placed a coat of many colors for that time, and in that culture was significant that he was the favorite, and that he would be even just more adorned than the other brothers. That didn't sit well with them. I know myself, I'm the oldest brother, and if one of my younger brothers came up to me when I was young and said, "Hey, you're going to work for me, and remember that time you taped me to a post when we were playing Cowboys and Indians? You're going to pay." There would have been another reason to tape them to the post after that. Or even with Joseph in his dreams that God had showed him. He was only 17 years old, so we can imagine. 17-year-old. I know how I was when I was 17, and I didn't even like myself, so I know none of you would like me. But, being brash and being, and even going, even today at 55, if I was to roll into my mom and dad's and say, "Hey, Dad, you're going to bend down, bow down and serve me," I'd wake up next week. But life doesn't always go as we think, or even as we plan, or even as we build towards a future. And I'm sure we've all felt the pain of life, of life just not going as we planned, or our hopes, our dreams, our future plans. They're really so fragile that we can plan them out and say, this is how I'm going to go, and this is the path that my life is going to follow, or I'm going to follow. And all those can just melt away in moments. And it can leave us wondering, what in the world is going on here? And we've all had those moments, from everything going great, on time, on schedule. This is just marvelous, to this, God? Really? This is what I'm going to face. This is the plan, because we know the scripture from Jeremiah, and we know, and it's not just every figure in the Bible that we read about. It's us too. We're included in that. We're God's children, and He has a plan of some purpose, some sort for our life. And that statement is not cliche. He really does, because as children of the Most High, there is a plan for our life, and there is a purpose, because it's even His purpose to reach others, to make disciples, to be that inspiration for someone, to be that encourager to someone, to be that hope when someone is run out of hope. But in those plans, sometimes there is pain. And sometimes there is suffering that goes along with that. And we may not understand this side of heaven. And we may not understand that even in the moment. As times as I'm sure that we all have. I think one of the first questions that we had tonight was, who is someone that you know who has experienced hardship but handled it in an inspiring way? Anyone want to... someone that just jumps out at you, that they have experienced something that just wasn't very pleasant, or someone else was actually harming them, but yet they handled it in a godly way? Anyone? Okay. Well, I know for myself there to speak to, um, I, you heard Pastor Jimmy's statement and testimony from last week. When I felt the call of God on my life as a minister when I was around 18, and I said, no. My granddad was a minister. My dad was a minister. I had cousins, first cousins, both sides of the family. I thought, there are plenty. And I'd also seen things that were hurtful. And I thought, I'll serve God, but my plan for my life was actually that I would do my own deal, had my own company, and at 55, which I turned this past year, then I would give my heart to the Lord, and then I would sit on the pew, and then I would pay, do whatever I needed to do for the Lord. But ministry, no thank you. And the Lord let me go for a while. And then that changed. And it went from my plan, my goal was at 55 I was going to, be successful and could retire. But when I was 36, that all changed with one doctor's appointment, one x-ray. And I watched my world and my plans shatter into a million pieces. But then what I didn't know was God was right there, and He had orchestrated, even prior to this doctor's appointment, things in mine and Tammy's life that were financial decisions that were made 10 months in advance, that we thought we were being pretty sharp and pretty shrewd, but God had orchestrated it for our good and our benefit, because with that doctor's appointment and with that x-ray, I could no longer drive my tractor and trailer because the tumor in my chest had my windpipe in a D shape and was 80% closed off and could crush out at any minute. And I would have, even if I'd been in the hospital, they had told me there was nothing they could do because it was too far down. And if I had been driving, there would have been 40 tons of steel careening down a highway. So what do? You sit at the house. So, and even in that, he made preparation and made plans for us that this side of the event, you can see God's handiwork. But in the moment, it's hard to see. It's hard to see. You're having that what in the world is going on here moment. And it is hard to see. And tonight we're going to look at Joseph specifically. And he had those moments. He had to. But then he did not, even though there was pain, even though there was suffering in his journey to where God was bringing him, he still had, number one, his faith stayed strong in where it needed to be, because his faith was in God and what God had told him and had shown him in the dreams. But also, he did not allow the bitterness that he could have very easily picked up, held onto, and carried with him during this time in his life, to allow it, instead of bitterness, it not only made him better, but it was also gave him the ability to forgive his brothers at the end. So we're going to, and I hope that's the takeaway, not only for us tonight, but even in the future, that God, He even works through suffering. He even works through sorrow, and He can even work through confusion when we don't know what's going on. And the answer's not there, and it's not spoken, but it's all in all, we have to stand on the faith that it is to bring about God's plan for our good. So is there a purpose in pain? Pastor Jimmy and I had the privilege of listening to just an awesome speaker a few weeks ago in Dr. Samuel Chan. And and I told Pastor that I was going to use something that he dropped into us, and it has really just, he put something into our minds and into our spirits, and gave us something really to think about. Every Bible hero, every Bible figure, every child of God, God has used this model in some form or fashion to some extent. Some have maybe been, to one extreme, and some others to, but he uses these four things. It's declaration, distress, development, and demonstration. The first and the fourth are great. The declaration and the demonstration. They're great. They're easy. That's when God gives you a plan, or shows you a plan, or shows you a direction, or gives you a direction in your life, or someone that speaks into your life. And then the demonstration is the fulfillment of that, the finished product, let's say. But it's the second and the third that we would rather not talk about. The other long we would rather not go through or walk through or have to, but it's part of the journey too. And to get one, you get all four. First, in Joseph's case, and since we're using him tonight, the declaration was the dream. Here he was, a 17-year-old young man that had this dream. He was already his father's favorite, and he was, because he was the great-grandson of Abraham, he had the promise of the covenant. And so, he goes out and lays out his dreams to who? But all of his other brothers. Here's just a side note for us all. Be careful who you tell your dreams to. Be careful who you tell your dreams. Because they'll already, like I was talking about a little bit ago, in the natural, as the older brother, if one of my youngers had said, hey, you're going to be working for me and doing all that, something would have rose up. And it did in these boys too. It rose up, and here he was. The declaration was the exalted ruler, and that he would, that one day that the father and the brothers would bow down to him and in his presence. So there was the declaration for him that God had. But see, the jealousy rose up, and they looked and they saw and said, here comes that dreamer, and we're going to put an end to him. And they conspired to actually, they were going to murder him, kill him, but then one thought the better, and they said, hey, we'll just put him in a dry well in the pit. That began his distress of his journey and of his walk, and God fulfilling the plan. It wasn't Joseph's. I'm sure Joseph thought that, hey, I'm just going to go from 17, Dad's going to appoint me leader of the clan, and yada, 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 and it goes on, and that wasn't it. They put him in a dry well, and has any of us ever been in a dry well? Especially even speaking a dry well, when we thought that our prayers were bouncing off the ceiling and bouncing back and hitting us harder than they were heaven. And when we're having those what in the world is going on moments, that's the beginning of the distress and the dry well. But we find that even in the beginning of that, God was with him. Because then came and they said, hey, well, instead of killing him, we're going to get at least a few dollars out of him. So we sold him, and they sold him into slavery. So here went a born free man, and he went instantly from in that day of being who he was to being a slave. And then we find that he was taken to Egypt and sold to the captain of the guard. And our scripture will pick up there that here Joseph he's in Egypt. He's been sold to the captain of the guard as a slave. But in verse 2 it says, the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did. Joseph found favor not only with God, because it said the Lord was with him, even though he was in distress, even though he was in a slave, and even that Potiphar saw that the Lord's hand was upon this young man's life, and he found favor with him. But then it still didn't go exactly how you would have thought. I'm sure he probably thought, well, maybe this is it. You know, Potiphar's the captain of the guard. He has access to Pharaoh. He's given me charge over everything in his home, everything that he owns. So maybe I'll have access through Potiphar to Pharaoh, and that's the way it's going to be. Yeah, that's it. That's the way it's going to be. But that wasn't it. That wasn't it. We pick up, and he said, so he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. In other words, she went, rrrr. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, there again, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Here we find Joseph, the declaration of the dream of the exalted ruler, only to enter into the period of distress of the pit, and then to be sold into a slave, and then to be falsely accused. Tempted every day to choose whether to sin against God or to be faithful to God. During times of suffering, the question it asks, it says, during times of suffering and hardship, why is it vital for us to resist allowing our circumstances to determine what we believe about God and his plan for our life? Anyone? That's right. That's good. She's rested up. She's all right. You know, it is. We have to trust. We have to trust the plan. We have to trust God. We must stay faithful. I was even thinking, I'd wrote in the question that even as Job and all the things that were surrounding Job, and even in his circumstances, when his wife came to him and said, just curse God and end it all. And he told her that she spoke as a foolish child. You know. God speaks to you, or it's a dream, or it's a prophecy, or whatever. We get it in our head that it's going to happen such and such a way. And then you may not know how it's going to happen. So you just like this, something's down the road. Just look back and see how God brought you there. That's exactly right. We haven't seen the full picture yet. There's no way that we can grasp the full picture. Now, we would like to, and we can try to connect the dots all we want, but about the time you get 3 or 4 connected, God usually changes it. it's not that he's changed it. He just changes. It was his plan and his direction all along. We just got off course.
If you notice something, Joseph went in and out of distress and development.
Mm-hmm.
Here, talk about the 4 stages. Joseph goes in and out of distress and development. He's distressed when he's thrown in the pit. But then when he gets to Potiphar's house, he's in the development stage because now he's been placed in leadership. But then Potiphar's wife puts him right back in the, come on, man, help me out here.
Yeah.
Potiphar's wife puts him right back in the distress stage, right?
Exactly.
And so now he's going back through that again. And I think sometimes we think just because we come out of one distress, that we're never going to have to go back through distress situations again. But it's a constant cycle. And sometimes distress sets us up to get where God eventually wants us. Because if we don't ever go through that, we'll never get to that point.
We never grow. It builds the distress builds our faith when we stay. And I had even wrote this down. We can't get trapped in or by the moment. You can't get, in more or less have a knee-jerk reaction to something. You gotta, you trust and you do trust in the Lord. And even though distress does come and even confusion can come in that, it is still, it's taking you to the place or the level that God wants us to be there. And hey, you may go through a lot, and I've thought about this, and Pastor, I think I know he has too. Sometimes situations, the distress and the development can go back and forth to prepare you for one moment in life. One critical moment that you will be that person to whether lead someone to salvation or to bring them or to strengthen them, to encourage them, because you don't know what's going through someone else's mind. They may be saying, what in the world, and this world ain't worth it, and I'm ready to step out into eternity. And you be that person that God has taken through this journey to be there for them in their moment of need. Yeah.
Like somebody that has a wound. Every time that wound is open, the scar gets bigger and thicker, and it protects the underside. And then you build up a resistance against that hurt, or whatever you're going through. And you can tell the person, I know what you're going through. I've been through it myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Was the scripture, I've sat where they've sat. You notice, and I know I don't want to get too far off, but ever notice even veterans, Army veterans or servicemen, once they know, no matter what generation it was, once they talked to one another and they found out they were in the service, they start talking about their unit and what they did and this, that, whether it was peacetime or whether it was all, because most of them all went through basic. And they had those moments, like you were talking about, Vicki. They had that commonality of service, and they just bond instantly. And I'm sure the nurses in the room and so forth, you've seen patients that shared commonality, no matter what that was, or hurts that were commonality. You know what they've been through, maybe not exact, but you can definitely relate because you've had those same thoughts, those same feelings, and even the Lord was there. Going on to 13 through 23, wrongly accused. Here, like Pastor said, he was in a place of leadership. No one was greater in the house than he. And in other words, he could do what he wanted. He could have a sandwich when he wanted or whatever, was going on. But here he was wrongly accused because he wouldn't give in to sin. every day, every day. It says, when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept the cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and he ran out of the house. When the master heard this story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me. He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. And he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. 23 goes on and says, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever that he did. Here again, going through distress from a 17-year-old happy-go-lucky to the distress of the pit, to being a slave, to falsely accused, placed in prison, the prisoner, and then more development began to take place. Because you see, there was a common theme through all the distress that happened, every position that came because the development was there, because the Word tells us each time, what does it say? The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him. He hadn't left him. He hadn't forsaken him. He hadn't left him and said, kid, I've changed my mind. No, the Lord was with him, and he gave him favor and gave him success, even in the hard times, even in the difficult times, even in those moments of what in the world is going on. I thought I was getting closer to Pharaoh, and I'm going further away because now I'm in prison, for gosh sakes. Have you ever had a time in your life when you did the right thing but received what felt like the wrong outcome? Easy over here. Oh, well. I think we all have had those moments. We've all had those situations. You know, when you've tried to do the right thing, or you were doing the right thing, and you had the right motive and had the right heart, only to be, bit, sort of, and, yeah, serving the best you can in difficult situations, knowing that the Lord will come through just any day, just any day, only to discover you're in a deeper mess than you were before. In Potiphar's house, he was running from Mrs. Potiphar. And had done a pretty good job, Her story is full of holes because she called once and they all came running, but yet she screamed and nobody showed up. But anyway, there again, only that you're deeper, distress and development. Joseph may have thought, through the captain of the guard, I may gain access and maybe I can go back home. I'm sure that was, and that's when everything will begin to happen, but only to find himself a prisoner. But there again, the Lord was with him and stayed with him and gave him favor and gave him success in whatever that he did. We go on to find then that here he was, a prisoner in a deeper mess, more distress, but yet also deeper in development. Deeper in development. even though that there he was. He was the prisoner there. In our text of 41:8-16, it talks about Pharaoh's dream. Something happened there in prison while Joseph was there. Pharaoh had gotten angry with his butler and with the baker and had put them in prison, and they both had dreams. And Joseph, through God's discernment, had interpreted the dreams for them, and they had exactly came out as he had told them. One would lose his life and the other one would be restored. But he told him when he left, he said, remember me. When you're back in Pharaoh's presence, remember me. But the butler soon quickly forgot. So there not only was he a prisoner, he was a forgotten prisoner as well. But we find that then God's plan began because Joseph had exhausted it. He was 30 years old by this time, 13 years. From 17 years old and the dreamer of dreams to 30 years old in prison with no hope of ever getting out. But then God began. And he said, in the morning, his mind, talking about Pharaoh, he said his mind was troubled. And he sent for all the magicians, and the wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dream, but no one could interpret it for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me, and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams. He interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. Then when he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said that you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. We find that he is standing before Pharaoh, and we find that Joseph, he tells him, Pharaoh repeats the dream, and Joseph tells him not only the meaning, but he says this will happen because it's one and the same dream, but they are the same, but God is putting an exclamation point to it. So you can bet all you want to bet, if I can use that word in church. We'll play the lottery tomorrow. No, we won't. But anyway, that this is going to come to pass, that it's going to happen. And he even tells him, he says, in this, if you'll find a good and honest man to put over him, and he gave him the answer. He didn't say, I'm your good and honest man. There again, development, distress, development. He had come that he was just putting it out there. He wasn't trying to forward himself or try to get, no doubt he probably thought, I'm going to give the Pharaoh the dream and then he's going to throw me back in prison at that point in time. But then we find Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one discerning, wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace. All my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, had him ride in the chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? To be in the dungeon that morning, checking on prisoners, feeding prisoners, doing whatever, then standing before Pharaoh, interpreting a dream for him, and then all of a sudden you're second in command. Only God can do that. Only God can bring that declaration as a ruler, as we just read about. There again, real quick recap: from favored child to a dry well to a pit, to a slave, to favored slave, back to falsely accused prisoner, favored prisoner, forgotten prisoner, to ruler, second in command. And this didn't happen, though, overnight. It happened in a span of 13 years. 13 years of distress and development, all to reach demonstration. And we find that, but see, as they said in the video, Joseph hadn't fulfilled his dream. God had. And when it was time, when the moment was right, God brought the declaration in less than 24 hours. It took 13 years to get there. And guys, some of our journeys, we're still in distress and development and back and forth. And we may still have those days that we say, what in the world is going on? But when God finally, when He comes to where we're to be, He says, okay, you're ready. And here's the situation, or here's the time, or here's that one person, or here's that loved one that you've asked to go to church for up to 10 years. They finally go. And not only go, but they give their heart to the Lord, because you've been through and you've walked through the valleys, and you've went through things, and you've went through the mess, and you've went through the development. And we come, and all of that brought really to the point that we were talking about. When Joseph, it brought him, the land was saved through the famine. It brought his family there. They bowed down before him, not realizing who he was in the moment. And they flourished in the land. But then after his father died, it was the brothers got to thinking, remember what we did? Guys, he's ruler now, and Dad's gone. So we pick up over in chapter 50, and it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. I have them right there on this tablet. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. I am in the place of God, with a question. You intended to harm me. Some translations said, he literally said, am I God? But he says, but God you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you, your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. How many times did Joseph, no doubt, had prayed, whether in the pit, whether as a slave, whether in the house of Potiphar, whether in the dungeon, prayed, God asking, what in the world? What in the world? But you know, there may be those that would say, no, we shouldn't ask. We shouldn't ask. You just got to trust. We're reminded in Matthew 26 and 39 in closing this out. It says, going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Jesus in the garden, he said, Dad, what in the world? But not what I want, not my plan, not my plan. I'd like to stay. I got 12 great guys, 11, suddenly 11. 11 great guys that, man, we can knock this thing out of the park. But not what I want, what you want. And I'll go all the way. I'll stick to your plan. And I've found in my life, I've made many plans, from vacations to where I wanted to do this or that or the other. And I've always found God's plan was a whole lot better, a whole lot simpler. And God was always with me, as he was with Joseph. He was with me. Just like in the video, that was a beautiful vase. But who would have ever thought that vase would have been the perfect wind chime? And so my plans have been a lot like that vase. Man, Pastor knows how meticulous I try to be, to a fault. That, you know, it's going to be good. Oh, it's going to be good. Only for it to rain, you know. But, hey, it's God's plan. Declaration, remember that. Declaration, distress, development, demonstration. And anything before we close in prayer? Any thoughts? Any reflections? No? I think he was trying to myself, my take, the dream was always there. And every time I know how I would be wondering, as things got deeper, as things got messier, you know, how's this? I know God's with me, but still I think he had to trust God. He had to be faithful, because I don't think if he was faithful, he wouldn't have incurred the favor that he'd found. Like you said, everywhere that he went, every position that he rose to really the one in charge.
Well, it's a lesson on leadership too, that no matter where you're at in leadership, you may not be in the rosy position, you may not be in the sexy position,
Yeah.
or the position that everybody's coveting or wanting, but he found favor with God in every position, from Potiphar's house to even being in prison. None of us are going to sign up for the prison leadership role, right?
Right.
None of us are going to say, I want to be a part of that. Yet God found favor enough to place him in that, which prepared him to be able to lead all of Egypt.
Yep.
Because as they said, if he had not been found faithful in Potiphar's house or found faithful in the in leading, in saving, he saved an entire nation.
Yes.
And I didn't know the enemy tried to destroy him.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my point. The
Yeah.
favor of the Lord made him a target of Satan. And I mean, that's true for us still today.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And I think too, you know, him being such a young man when he had that dream, and I think some of his brokenness the day that he saw that dream come to pass, he never had a clue of when, where, and why his brothers, you know, when you're young, oh, you're going to bow down to me.
Mhm.
And then he was so broken when he saw his brothers. I mean, it didn't make him feel prideful, you know, it broke him, it humbled him.
Yeah. Probably even to the point that they're at the last, who knows, Jacob may have written something out. I kind of doubt it by family history. But even that, you know, he could have had them killed the moment when he first accused them as spies and everything else. And, you know, and I'm sure his thoughts were, you know, as I could have had that done and no one would have even questioned. But, you know, as good as I've been, and you know that you still are worried about this, you know, so let's bury it once and for all. But I think to Danielle's point too, he excelled everywhere that he was, no matter what, because I'm sure he didn't start at the top, but he probably went in with a mindset, I'm going to be the best at whatever it is. You know, as Pastor said, it may not be the thing, but it may, you know, it may be something here at the church of straightening the chairs or something like that, some simple that nobody really, but, you know, if you're the mindset, I'm going to be the best chair straightener that Tazewell First Assembly ever had, God honors that. Because, and with that, things, you know, that you go to different levels, because I'm sure he didn't walk into prison as the top dog in charge. And I'm sure he didn't come off the caravan in Potiphar's house, top dog in charge. But when he did move up, by the timeline, he probably moved up fairly quickly, but still yet it was 13 years from the pit to the palace.
Didn't it say how well Potiphar did with him there? He probably wished he'd sent his own lady to the jail.
Well, he also learned how to serve. He
Yeah.
learned how to be a servant. And, you know, even though he was cocky and arrogant in telling his brothers his dreams, you know, he became a servant real quickly. And that could be part of that process, is that he learned how to become a servant. And when you learn to serve first, then you can lead greatly.
Yeah.
When you learn to serve.
Because even interpreting the dream of Pharaoh, he could have said, I got the answer, but if you set me free, I'll give it to you. Or, you know, you put me in charge and I can make things happen, you know, like that. But he said, no, you just need a guy that can do this. And Pharaoh he said, well, you're the guy. You're the guy. But, you know, because I'm sure, like I said, I thought he thought they've got me cleaned up just to send me back to that nasty dungeon here in about 3 seconds, you know. So, you know, because there again, I'm sure as a young man, he thought, you know, when he was probably there with Potiphar and doing a good job running for Mrs. Potiphar, that you know, he thought that may have been his access, and he definitely thought maybe his access was with the cupbearer, because he said, hey, you know, this other dude, by sundown you dead. But, you know, the cupbearer, he says, when you stand before Pharaoh, remember me. But it wasn't time. It wasn't time, you know. But anyway, let's move to prayer.